Welcome to 279W at Clackamas Community College. I will be your instructor, Robert McMillan, and we're going to talk all about Microsoft Windows Server 2016. I'm going to show you how to install Active Directory, how to add users and groups, and even get into group policy a little bit. So we've got a lot of great things to go over, and let's go ahead and take a look at the different objectives that we'll be talking about in this class. So as you can see here, we're going to be looking at the different versions, the different editions of Windows Server 2016, and we're going to be looking at the requirements in order to install it, as well as looking at various different concepts such as IPv4. Some of you may have already taken the communications class where you learned about TCP/IP. Some of you may not have, so we're going to go ahead and cover that a little bit anyway, just to be sure you've got all those concepts covered. Now, these particular videos for each of the modules, there's 9 modules in total, embedded in each of the different module labs, you'll also see shorter videos that will cover specific tasks, such as when we go to install Active Directory, there's a short video on how to do that. So if you get stuck, you'll be able to click on that particular link, it'll take you to a video and it'll show you how to do it. So there's around 35 little mini videos interspersed throughout all the different module labs. But in these videos, we're just going to cover what is going to be in the chapters in the books. Now, what's really important about that, besides just getting an overall conceptual view of the class, is that a lot of these videos are going to cover what's on the quizzes. Now, the quizzes, the midterm and the final, they're all open book. However, there is a time limit, so you don't want to take too much time in looking for all the answers, and watching these videos will help you get there much more quickly. So let's take a look at our first chapter and various different things about Windows Server 2016 before we get started into the lab. So we've got lots of different platforms here. We've got Windows Server 2016 Essentials. We've got the Standard Edition and the Data Center Edition. And as you can imagine, the higher up you go, the more expensive it gets. And you not only have to pay for the operating system, but also the client access, the CALs, the client access licenses as well. So we've got some additional Windows Server 2016. We've got a multi-point premium server. These are typically used by schools where you can have thin clients, and it's sort of like what we used to call a terminal server, but now it's called remote desktop server. But it's specific for schools and other organizations that are nonprofits. We also have Windows Storage Server 2016, and Storage Server allows you to turn your Windows Server into an iSCSI target. So it allows you to connect storage from another server to it, rather than buying a big expensive box of hard drives. And we'll talk about that in upcoming modules as well. And then we have Hyper-V Server. Hyper-V Server is just for Hyper-V. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get Hyper-V virtual machines to work on other versions, but this one is designed just to do Hyper-V, and that's it. So it's a less expensive version of Windows Server. So for instance, on the Standard Edition, if you buy the Standard Edition, you also get 2 free Hyper-V virtual machines with it that you can install. On the data center, you get unlimited amounts of virtual machines, Hyper-V, that you can put on there. On Essentials, you get 0. So there's various different rules for each version. So let's take a look at what each of these different versions support, because I know there's going to be some quiz questions on that. We've got the Essentials Edition, as I mentioned earlier, has 25 users. It can take up to 16.8 million connections, probably not going to ever reach that, of course. You can put up to 2 physical processors on there. Now, Server 2016 is licensed different than 2012. 2012 was licensed by the physical processor, but 2016 is licensed by the cores on each processor. But this particular version will take 2 physical processors. Doesn't matter how many cores are on there. It will take 50 remote desktop connections and 50 routing and remote access connections, which are basically just VPN connections. So this edition cannot join a domain other than to move data from one server to another. And it provides most of the server roles that the Standard Edition has, but not all of the options. The standard edition you're going to find is going to be the most popular, and it's going to be the one we'll be installing in this class. So when you go to download your Windows Server, you're going to want to choose the standard edition. Now, if you accidentally choose the Data Center edition, that's fine. It'll work the same way. It's just going to use a little bit more resources, so it might be a little bit slower, but other than that, it'll work fine. So the standard edition provides file and print services, internet connectivity, centralized management of users, and applications and network resources, all of which we'll be doing in this particular class. New features in 2016 over 2012. The Start button and Start menu are back on the desktop, so that's a lot better. Everybody likes that. Active Directory is much easier to set up, and improved file security. So with every edition of Windows Server, you get a higher quality security. A domain controller can be cloned to quickly create additional domain controllers. It also provides other things like GRE, which we won't get to in this class, but in future classes. Of course, Hyper-V is included, and you can clone these virtual machines much more quickly than you could in the past. You also have something called containers. Now, containers are not something we're going to talk about in this class much, but they enable applications on one computer to run in an isolated version or fashion on, with the ability to execute multiple applications. So basically, that's just a fancy way to say that you can separate your applications from the operating system in a secure manner, the same way you can separate virtual machines from the host operating system, which is exactly what you'll be doing in this class. You've got your host operating system, which is your laptop, your desktop, or the computer lab computers. But you've got virtual machines that run inside it, and they are completely separate from each other as far as security goes. And you can now do that with applications using containers in 2016. So we've got other things going on with 2016, mission critical applications, much larger databases. Basically what they did was they took the 2008 version of Windows, which they used to call Enterprise. And when they went to 2012, they put all those features into the standard version of 2012 and carried that to 2016. So all the things that you could not do with 2008 standard, but you could do with Enterprise, you can do with the standard version now, which is very good. You can cluster up to 64 computers. I haven't seen that happen yet, but I have clustered a lot of servers in the past. I just never had the opportunity to cluster 64 of them. So clustering allows us to have redundancy in case one of these servers goes bad, then everything rolls over to another server. So there are some differences between the standard edition and the data center. One of the big ones, as I mentioned earlier, is virtualization. So virtualization, by default, like I said, the standard version comes with 2 virtual machines, but you can put as many on as you want. However, as the data center edition gives you unlimited licenses to put on as many virtual machines on there as you like. There's also some cloud computing and some database handling differences between the two. We won't cover those much in this class, but they could be covered in upcoming classes as well. Hyper-V Server 2016, it is a free download. It works on any particular computer that has the standard or data center editions on them, or the Hyper-V version as well. And it doesn't cost anything extra to install it, but if you get the standard edition or the Hyper-V edition, then you're going to need to pay for the licenses to put onto that particular server. So for instance, if you have 5 virtual machines on the standard edition, the first 2 are free, but then the next 3 you're going to have to go buy the licenses in order to get those to work. Active Directory, this is one of the first things we're going to be doing in this class in the first lab. It's a database, and it means it's an extensible database. It can expand and contract based on how many objects you put in there. And it includes users and groups and all these different objects. They're all basically referred to as an object. Active Directory doesn't really call a user any different than an object. It's as far as the value of it goes. They both have the same value, but one is a user that logs into a computer and the other is the computer the user logs into. It also includes shared printers, shared folders, and other network resources. 2016 now supports Linux, and basically you can put Linux virtual machines onto the server, as well as create shares that Linux computers can connect to. So Microsoft has finally stopped fighting Linux and decided to partner up with them to a certain degree. There's a lot of different roles and features in Windows Server, and you're going to see this coming up in the labs. It'll make a lot more sense. And some of the features include things like Server Manager, security, clustering, things like these are all things that you can install onto the server, but by default they are not installed. They are just available to add, and you do that through the Server Manager. So Server Manager enables the server to add all these different roles and features. It also allows you to help troubleshoot using the best practices analyzer. Tells you whether or not you've got something that's not secure or not set up right. So it's used to do all these different things that you see in this list, and you will definitely see how to do every one of those that you see on this page in upcoming labs. We can also set up Internet Information Services. This is something that we do in the 288 class. We actually set up some web pages and things like that. Now, it's not an HTML programming class, it's just how to get a web server to work on Server 2016. But that's also included. And you've got lots of different modules that you can install as well. Windows Server Core. So basically, if you wanted to get Core or Nano Server, these are also options. Windows Server Core is a minimal server configuration. So if you don't have a lot of resources or you want extremely high security, then you can go with Server Core or Nano Server. And they're just slightly different from each other. So Server Core, minimum server configuration, doesn't have anything installed into it by default except for the necessary minimum features. Does not provide a graphical interface. It's just a command line. So you're going to get what looks like a black DOS prompt is what we used to call it. But now it just looks like a command line. You can add these additional roles and features if you want. You do get a mouse pointer, which is nice. You do have some graphical tools to configure the server, but not a lot. Whereas the Nano server doesn't even have any of the graphical tools available. So it's a little bit, even more bare bones. Tended to be faster and need less maintenance. So Nano Server as a platform is something that sometimes Microsoft refers to, and you can make that a DNS server, DHCP server, web server, database, things like that. So you can install those all on the Nano Server. Now, in every version of Windows, you have something called PowerShell. So PowerShell is a command line interface. And you're going to see PowerShell. We're going to do some PowerShell, just a few commands in this particular class. And the difference between a command prompt and typing in a command and doing PowerShell is just slightly different. So in PowerShell, every time you run a PowerShell script, it's called a .ps1 file. Then you're going to have a whole bunch of different things happen. And in upcoming classes or in other classes, you can see a little bit more of how that works. But in this class, we'll just be running a few of the commands. So it's almost like a batch file. If you've ever run a batch file that maybe creates a folder and shares a folder and does various different things all at once, well, PowerShell is like that as well, but we create these scripts called these PS1 files. And it does a whole bunch of things whenever you type anything into it. So you can run basic command line commands in PowerShell, such as the dir command, the ping command, that kind of stuff. It just ignores the fact that it's in PowerShell. However, you can't run PowerShell scripts in the command line. And you typically can tell the difference between the two because it has a little PS in front of it. So it'll say PS for PowerShell when you're in PowerShell. It doesn't always show a blue box or a black box. It could be many different colors. So that's why you want to look for whether or not it has the PS in front of it. So you can see a lot of these different tasks that you can do with PowerShell. So let's take a look at multitasking and multithreading. So multitasking is the ability to run 2 or more programs at the same time. The Server 2016, of course, can do that. Multi-threading is a little bit different, and so this is where we get into some of these quiz questions, so just pay attention there to these kinds of things. So multi-threading is the capability of programs written to run several program code blocks or threads at the same time. So these are two, just, a little bit different from each other, but they are distinct, that you should see the difference. So one is code blocks, several program code blocks or threads. That's why we call it multi-threading. And the other is the ability to run an entire program. Sometimes you have certain programs that share certain parts of certain files, like DLL files, dynamic link library files, that other programs do as well. And so multi-threading allows you to have those programs share those files at the same time. If you didn't have multi-threading, then you would have one program crashing into another program all the time. Now multitasking, however, says, hey, I can run Microsoft Word at the same time I can run Active Directory users and computers, for instance. So that's what multitasking is, and that's kind of the difference between the two. Then you have preemptive multitasking, where each program runs in an area, area of memory separate from areas used by other programs. And that's really important, because if you don't have this preemptive multitasking, what used to happen back in the Windows 95 and 98 days was that you would have programs trying to run in the same memory space. So what Windows does is it sees ahead of time that these programs are going to do that, and then it separates those memory spaces even before they start to run. Physical processor plugged into a socket. So every computer has a processor, at least one physical processor that sits into a socket on the motherboard. You can have one, in a standard desktop or laptop. Servers can have 2 or 4 or 8. So there's lots of different configurations. You're not going to find an odd number in those configurations. You're not going to find 3 or 5, because they have to be able to run in parallel. A logical processor is something also that we refer to as a core. So you can have lots of cores running on a physical processor, or you could also refer to that as lots of logical processors that run on a physical processor. A virtual processor is a little different. It's a logical processor that uses a specific virtual machine. So when you create a virtual machine on a server, it creates a virtual processor for that. Now it uses some of the physical processor to get that virtual processing done. But you can have a lot of virtual processors running inside a physical one. And there's really no limit to the amount of virtual processors that you can set up. The limitation is really the program that you're using. So if you're using VMware, you may see 2, 4, or 8 processors. If you're using Hyper-V, then you may get, you may see 8, you may see 16. It all depends on the program and the capabilities of the physical processor in combination. So as you can see here at the bottom, Hyper-V can support up to 320 logical processors. However, we're going to be using VMware, but we're not going to get anywhere near 320 of them. So let's go ahead and move on a little bit further here. A protocol consists of guidelines for the following: how data is formatted into discrete units called packets and frames. Packets and frames are units of data transmitted from a sending computer to a receiving computer. So now we're getting a little bit into networking. So Windows Server 2016 used TCP/IP as its main version of communicating from one server to the next. And of course, TCP/IP is what we use when we go out to the internet. So it's using the same protocol. And you would think that this is just a given, that, why would you even mention that you're using TCP/IP? Of course that's what we're using. Well, that's because Windows Server didn't always use TCP/IP. It used many different protocols in the earlier versions, and so it's worth noting that it's using mainly TCP/IP going forward. A local area network is a network of computers that are in the same physical building, or they could actually have more than one building attached to each other. So that we refer to as a LAN. Now, there's also a WAN, wide area network, which is the rest of the internet, or you could have a MAN, a metropolitan area network, which is a series of buildings that are somehow tied together. TCP is basically a type of data transmission. It's a protocol It has a connected version to it. So basically when you go from one computer to another, TCP makes sure that it gets to that other end. And if it doesn't, it retransmits the packet. So it's connection oriented is what we call it. UDP, however, is not connection oriented. It will just try to send it as best it can. And if it can't, oh well. Then a lot of games use UDP instead of TCP. Now the other side of TCP is IP. So this TCP/IP is actually two different protocols. So IP is Internet Protocol, and lots of different things can run over IP. So there's TCP, as we mentioned, there's UDP, there's GRE, there's lots of different protocols, about 15 or 20 of them, that can run over IP. Sometimes I refer to IP as the car, and you can put TCP in as the driver, UDP in as the driver. All these different other protocols can sit in the IP car to drive to your destination. So there's two different versions of TCP/IP. There's IP version 4 and 6 that are commonly used. IPv4 is what we'll be using in this class. IPv6 is going to be the replacement, and it's mostly because there's a lot more addresses available with IPv6. At one point, I believe it's something like 80 trillion IP addresses for every person on the planet, whereas IPv4 can only handle up to 4 billion. So we've got lots of different examples of what TCP/IP looks like. You're going to see those throughout this course. One example that you see listed here is the 192.51.100.0. So TCP/IP, or I should say IP version 4, is 32 bits long. So they're basically broken up into 4 octets. So 192 is an octet, 51 is an octet, 100 is an octet, etc. And so if you've taken the classes that talk about these kinds of things, you're probably already familiar with it. Unicast and multicast. Unicast, transmission in which one packet is sent from a server to each client that requests it. So that's the majority of the types of connectivity that we see between our computers. So when you go from your client computer to your server, you're basically having a unicast type of connection. Multicast is a little different. Server is able to treat all clients as a group and sends one packet per transmission that reaches all clients. So sometimes if you are going to have, say, a big group meeting online, that's more of a multicast. It basically takes one computer and sends the same packet to everybody else all at once at the same time, so all of you can see that video all at the same time. So that's a good example of multicast versus unicast. Broadcast is something that happens basically when a computer first connects to the network. So it connects to a network switch, and then it broadcasts out and says, hey, where is everybody and who's all there? The switch then sends that information back over to the computer. The switch actually keeps a record of all this information to try to keep broadcasts down, because the more broadcasts there are, the slower a network works. Subnet masks is what separates the different classes of IP addresses. We'll be working with a Class C network address, which will be 192.168.0. And the subnet mask basically is 255 3 times .0, which you will see coming up. So you can see the different types of IP addresses. We've got the highest number you can go to is .254. You've got the network number 127.0.0.0, cannot be assigned to anything because the people who created IP version 4 decided that that would be what's called a loopback address, which just basically makes sure that the computer is running properly. So if I ever am having problems with communication, one of the things I'll do is I'll try to ping 127.0.0.1 on my computer. If it works, then that means I know that internally my network card is probably acting as it should. So that's a loopback address basically just for troubleshooting. There's private IP addresses and there's public IP addresses. We're going to be using private IP addresses in our example. So 192.168 is a private IP address. So basically, you're not going to find any website on the internet that starts with 192.168. It just will not exist because they've been designated as private IP addresses used inside networks. Now, I can use 192.168.0.1 and you can use it because there is something called network address translation. So our routers translate our private addresses out to public addresses when we go out on the internet. So that way nobody knows what our private address is, and it allows us to reuse that same 192.168 subnet over and over and over. IP version 6 provides a logical path from 4, so if you've run out of IP addresses, you can certainly do that. 128-bit address capability, so remember version 4 has 32 bits, so version 6 has 128 bits. So that means that's a lot of addresses. So you can see some of the different information here. We don't do a lot on IP version 6, so I won't cover that much of it, but I just want you to be aware that it's out there. And other classes, we will be doing IP version 6. So it is better communications for routing and subnets. It does provide some security. Overall, IP version 6 is just a better protocol. However, the reason we don't use it so much is because it is like the metric system. It's just a new thing that we have to learn that people just don't want to learn. So it's more complicated, but overall it's a better way to go. So out on the internet, we're using IP version 6 all the time. Most countries are now on IP version 6. And even if you look at your phone's IP address, the public IP address on your phone, it probably is an IP version 6 address. There are two different types of addressing. So when you first plug your network card into a switch, or in this case virtually, then you're going to be presented with an option. You can either have a DHCP server, Dynamic Host Control Protocol server, assign you an address automatically, or you can statically set it. Now, we don't have a DHCP server to start with, so we're going to have to start out with a static address. So you're going to be statically assigning the addresses of your servers as well as your client. You also need a gateway. A gateway basically gets you out of your local area network out to the internet. So a gateway, of course, is also very important. If for some reason you don't have a DHCP server and you don't statically set it, then basically Microsoft will have your network card assign what's called an automatic private IP address. So it'll be on a 169.254 address, just as you see here. So with these addresses, basically it allows you to have the, let's go back a second there. It allows you to have computers to be able to talk to each other even without a DHCP server present. So that is a real handy thing to have in small networks that don't have a server with a DHCP server on it. Automatic configuration can be disabled through Windows Server 2016. So if you don't want a PIPA to work, then you can disable it through the registry. So dynamic addressing through a DHCP server. So this is where you set up the DHCP role on Windows Server 2016, and you create a group of IP addresses that are going to be available to any computer that connects to it. So that way you can control what IP addresses people get when they connect to your server. All right, now we're going to talk about some Windows deployment services, things like that. So most operating systems come with a list of minimum hardware requirements, and it's important to go through those different things to make sure that you have the minimum amount of RAM, minimum processor, and hard drive space. Then there's the recommended amount of requirements. So if you do the minimum, it's going to run, but it's going to run very slowly. If you do the recommended, then it's going to run the way Microsoft intended it to be. You've got to partition a disk. So first you take your disk and you create a partition, And I remember long ago, back in the 1980s, you'd have an actual book that you'd have to walk through page by page just to partition a disk. It was that difficult. But nowadays, Microsoft makes it so you just right-click on the drive and just format it, or create the partition right away. Then after the partition's created, then you can divide it up by formatting it into chunks. So you can format that as one large formatted partition or individually sized chunks. And during the installation of 2016, it will prompt you to partition and then format the drive. So during the installation, you're going to see exactly like you see here. You're going to see the unallocated space, which you can then go ahead and choose to format, and then click Next, and then it will go ahead and do the installation. After installation, you're going to see Server Manager pop up, and the disk management tool to create additional partitions is available in case you want to use it. So you would go to File and Storage Services, go to Click on Disks, and then you'll have the ability to divide that disk up further if you would like. The type of formatting that Microsoft uses is called NTFS. They call it New Technology File System, but of course it's been around since the 90s. It includes a lot of different things, such as you see here. One of the things that I like to use personally is disk quotas. That keeps the users from being able to save too much data on the network. Compression is good. It gets you a little bit more space. If you're running out of space, you can compress the disk. Makes it run slower, but you can get more space out of it in case you're running out. And all these other different things are available. REFS, this is the replacement to NTFS. And it's supposed to be faster, better at fixing errors, disk errors and things like that. However, it's not ready for prime time. So you can't shrink the partition, extend the partition. Once the partition gets to be more than 50% full, sometimes it fails. You're unable to add any additional data to it. So REFS is new, it's supposed to be better, but it's not quite ready yet for prime time. So I don't recommend anybody using that as of yet, but hopefully in the next 5 years or so, they will get REFS to work properly. However, if REFS was working properly, all these features that you see here would be valid. All right, so Microsoft recommends creating a computer name. You have to create a computer name. By default, it creates its own, but if you want, you can rename it. And that'll be something that we do, and something that I show you how to do in the mini lab videos that you'll see in the labs itself. So here are the requirements. You might see those come up on a quiz, so keep that slide handy. Active Directory Domain Services role, this is what you need to install, and which I do show you how to do in the lab mini videos. You have to install that in order to get Active Directory to work. So you have to install the role first, and then you promote the server to be a domain controller after that. So you'll be seeing exactly how to do that step by step, and you'll be given directions on how to do that as well. So a server is just a server until you put Active Directory on it. Then it becomes a domain controller. It can control any computer connected to it, and you can manage those computers as well as their security. So you've got several different ways you can install Server 2016, DVD or USB thumb drive. Those are both options. You can upgrade from 2012 or 2012 R2. It's not recommended, however, because sometimes that doesn't go well. So even Microsoft won't recommend that you upgrade it. They'll recommend that you do a fresh install. You can also install a virtual server using Hyper-V, or in your case VMware, and you can also push it out using Windows deployment services. So what I can do is I can have a server available to push out an image to a computer when it first boots up, when it's got nothing on it. So it's a really cool type of experience to be able to take a blank hard drive and connect to the server using something called PXE, which we refer to as PXE, Pre-Execution Environment. And it connects to the server says, here's your image, and it installs Windows on it remotely. It's very cool. So you're going to be installing from your ISO file, but if you were to install Windows Server 2016 on an empty physical computer, you would start from the DVD or the thumb drive, and you would insert that and then run through all the different prompts until the server is installed, which we do demonstrate. All right, let's move on a little bit more. WDS role, Windows Deployment Services. I mentioned that to you earlier. That's where you can push out an installation from a WDS server. You do not need a DVD in that particular case. So you do need Server Manager. Server Manager is a very good utility to do a lot of different things. And it provides computer information, time zone, IP information. All this stuff is available as soon as you open up Server Manager. So you'll be seeing that it launches automatically the first time you log into Windows. So after Server 2016 is installed, you need to activate the copy of the operating system. Now, if you install the demo version, which I recommend, I actually have links and instructions on how to do that, or you install the Imagine version that you get, with your Clackamas Microsoft license, you can certainly activate them if you want, but you only get so many activations, which is why I don't recommend you do it. What I recommend you do is that you use the demo version, which lasts longer than the class does, and then you can use it over and over and over. So that way you don't end up using your few activated copies that you get with Microsoft Imagine. So here's where you enter the product key. It'll pop up under the control panel system icon. You can enter the product key and then it'll automatically find the Microsoft database and it will activate the license. And the demo version, like I said, you don't need to do that. You don't need a key. It just works for 180 days, which again is longer than the class is. All right, so a lot of this has to do with activation. All right, so that is basically our summary for the first couple of chapters, and we're going to go into Module 2 after this. So go ahead, go into your lab, look at the instructions, check out the little mini videos, and go ahead and start doing your lab. Of course, if you need any assistance, I'll be available for a remote session with you. I can remote into your computer from wherever I am, and we can have a phone call and I can assist you in any issues. So that's it for Module 1, and good luck on Lab 1.